The fluorescent lights at Oak Creek Memorial hummed their nightly hum, a sound Natalie Hayes had learned to filter out 18 years ago. She moved through the ER like she was trying not to be seen, and mostly, she succeeded. The night shift suited her: fewer administrators, fewer eyes, fewer questions about the scar tissue on her left shoulder that no amount of concealer could fully hide. She adjusted her loose-fitting scrubs and checked the 4 lines on Bay 3, her movements economical and precise, nothing wasted, everything deliberate. A broken dog tag hung in her pocket, suspended on a chain so frayed it was barely holding. She touched it without thinking, a gesture so habitual that her hand found it the way a compass finds north. The metal was warm from her body heat. She could feel the rough edges where shrapnel had scored it 2 decades ago in Ramadi, where the building had come down and she had come up from under the rubble with a 7-year-old boy in her arms and 14 other civilians scattered like broken toys across a courtyard that smelled like copper and dust and the acrid burn of explosives. That was another lifetime. That was Major Natalie Hayes, before the records were sealed, before her unit disbanded, before the classified operation was officially erased by people in Pentagon basements who dealt in secrets the way other people dealt in currency. Now she was just a night shift nurse at a mid-size Portland hospital, unremarkable and invisible, exactly as she had planned. The ER bay doors hissed open. A patient came through with a twisted ankle and a complaint about the wait time. Behind him, a drunk college student with lacerations on his palm. Nothing urgent. Nothing that would pull her deeper into the machinery of the hospital during daylight hours when she might have to stand in the break room and speak to people who had never learned her name despite sharing a unit with her for 8 years. Maria passed her in the corridor, pushing a clean linens cart. Maria worked the night shift too, but she belonged here in a way Natalie never would. Maria laughed in the break room. Maria complained about her sister's custody battle and her landlord's refusal to fix the heating. Maria was a person. Natalie was a function. Caldwell's on a rampage again, Maria said quietly, glancing over her shoulder toward the administrative area. Saw him in his office at midnight, dressed like he just came from a country club. Apparently he ripped into Rodriguez for charting something 2 minutes late. 2 minutes. Like Rodriguez killed someone. Natalie nodded without speaking. This was the rhythm of night shift under Dr. Caldwell, competent cruelty delivered from a man who treated anyone below his salary grade like poorly trained service staff. He moved through the hospital in Italian shoes and custom-tailored shirts that screamed old money and assumed superiority. His father had been a cardiac surgeon in New York. His mother had been a corporate board member. Caldwell himself had never had to want for anything in his life, which meant he had never developed the particular kind of respect that comes from surviving scarcity. The respect that came from surviving Ramadi. He's in a mood, Maria continued, lowering her voice further. Someone told him night shift has better outcome metrics than day shift. He didn't like that. He said the numbers must be wrong because we are not sophisticated enough to manage complex cases without supervision. Natalie's jaw tightened. Just slightly. A clench she caught and released before anyone could see it. This was stage 1 of Caldwell's rotation, the social attacks, the dismissive jabs, the casual cruelty that rolled off his tongue like charm. He would never step into her operating space with direct aggression. That would require acknowledging her as a genuine threat rather than as background scenery. She had survived worse than his condescension. She had survived enough for 10 people. The ER monitor above her head beeped steadily, tracking the heart rates of stable patients. She checked her watch, 2:53 a.m. Another hour and a half before the shift started to lighten, before the day shift crew arrived with their coffee and their voices and their conscious awareness that Natalie existed. She touched the dog tag again. The metal was smooth on one side, where it had been worn by someone else's hands for months before it came into her possession. She had never taken it off. She had sewn it into pockets, hidden it under uniforms, moved it from locker to locker, always keeping it close enough to feel it beating against her ribs like a second heartbeat. A heartbeat that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. A boy she wasn't supposed to remember. A promise she wasn't supposed to keep. The intercom crackled. Incoming trauma, GSW ×5. Marine, ETA 3 minutes. The world went still. Natalie's hands froze midway through updating the patient chart in Bay 2. Her breath caught in a way she hadn't let it catch in 2 decades. The fluorescent lights above her head suddenly seemed very bright, very sharp, the kind of brightness that made everything visible and left nowhere to hide. GSW times 5. Marine. Her face went absolutely blank. That was the only defense she had left, the ability to make her expression into something that reflected nothing, revealed nothing, meant nothing to anyone observing. But inside, something dangerous flickered awake, like a predator opening its eyes after a long sleep. A muscle memory. A protocol that belonged to a different version of herself. She had not used that version of herself in 20 years. Did you hear that? Maria grabbed her arm. Jesus, 5 gunshot wounds? That's serious. Who brings a Marine to Oak Creek? We don't have the capability for. We have what we need, Natalie said quietly. Her voice had dropped a full octave. She hadn't heard herself make that sound in years. Bay 1 through 4 cleared. What? I mean, yes, but. Get me 14-gauge angiocaths, type O negative uncrossed, 2 units hanging, and someone needs to call up blood bank for emergency release. Natalie was already moving toward the trauma bays, her limp completely gone, her shoulders straight, her movements fluid and economical in a way that belonged to someone with different training than civilian nursing school. Trauma surgery. Dr. Caldwell's on call. He's in his office, but. Get him. Now. Maria stared at her for a full second, mouth slightly open, as if seeing Natalie for the first time and finding someone entirely different wearing her scrubs. Then she moved. Not because Natalie had asked nicely. Because something in Natalie's voice had shifted into a frequency that made obedience the only rational response. The bay doors opened. Paramedics rushed through with a stretcher and a man whose chest bore 5 distinct wounds, blood already soaking through emergency field dressings that were doing nothing except containing the visible hemorrhage. Natalie's breath steadied. Her mind snapped into the compartmentalized clarity she had trained for, the ability to process a human body as a complex machine with specific failure points and specific solutions. She could see his face between the medic and the stretcher rail. Dark hair. Broad shoulders. A face that had aged 20 years in the 2 decades she had spent hiding from it. She moved toward him with the same steady composure she would have used for any patient, except that her hands had started shaking, and stopped, caught the tremor before it could register in her fingers, locked it down somewhere deep where nobody could see what it meant. The Marine General blinked. His eyes met hers for less than a second before the medics repositioned him, and something flashed across his face. Recognition? No. Delirium from blood loss. Just trauma and hypoxia and the particular tunnel vision that came with dying. Vitals, she asked the paramedic, her voice steady as a surgeon's laser, the voice of someone who had given orders in worse conditions than this. BP 94/58 and dropping, O2 sat 89, heart rate 142, 3 of the 5 wounds are in the thoracic cavity, 1 possibly cardiac, the paramedic rattled off, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. We got a needle decompression on the left side at scene, but he's still deteriorating. Natalie nodded once. She was already scanning the wounds, already assessing trajectory and depth and which vessels were likely compromised. The muscle memory was perfect. It was terrible. It was everything she had tried to bury under 18 years of quiet competence and deliberate invisibility. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the bay entrance, already pulling on gloves, already radiating the arrogant certainty of a man who had never met a problem money couldn't solve. He looked at Natalie with the same dismissive assessment he always wore, a tired night shift nurse in loose scrubs, clearly too intimidated by his presence to meet his eyes. He didn't see her hands. He didn't see the way she was reading the patient's exsanguination rate the way other people read weather reports. He didn't see the shift that had happened in her spine the moment she heard GSW times 5. He didn't see the woman who had once held a collapsing building together with nothing but will and training and the absolute refusal to let people die on her watch. "Get me a surgical kit," Caldwell said, not looking at her. "And someone competent." "Where's Rodriguez?" Natalie didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She turned toward the supply cabinet with the kind of focused precision that belonged to someone who had already decided what would happen next, because there was only one thing that could happen, only one outcome that was acceptable, and she was going to ensure it with the same steady hands that had pulled a terrified 7-year-old boy from under 2 tons of concrete. The Marine General's eyes closed as the monitors beeped their rising alarm. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as they wheeled him through the trauma bay doors. 5 gunshot wounds, clustered center mass, the kind of grouping that took training and intent. Natalie's hands moved to the forecart on instinct, but her eyes stopped moving. Stopped thinking. Stopped everything. The face was older. Harder. Weathered by 20 years that had turned a terrified 7-year-old into a man built like a warship. But the shape of his jaw was identical. The scar on his left temple, the one she'd stitched with shaking hands under sniper fire in a bombed-out clinic in Ramadi, was still there, more pronounced now but unmistakably the same. Rafik. The boy she'd pulled from 2 tons of concrete rubble while rounds chewed through the walls around them. The boy who'd translated for her squad, who'd clung to her uniform with fingers too small to grasp what was happening. Now he was a Marine general, unconscious and bleeding out. "Type and cross, 8 units, Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through the monitors like a scalpel. "Get me a trauma surgeon. Page Dr. Morris. Now." Natalie forced her hands to move. Muscle memory took over, the part of her that didn't need a name or a face to know what to do. She found the 18-gauge needle, felt for the vein in his left arm, the skin still warm, still alive. The catheter slid in with that small satisfying hiss of air. She started the first bag, watching the saline flow, her respiration steady even as something deep inside her chest cracked open like concrete under a sledge. How many times was he hit, she heard herself asking, her voice belonging to someone else. Someone controlled. Someone professional. 5 rounds, point-blank range, approximately 45 minutes ago, one of the paramedics said, still holding the stretcher. Found him in his car in the parking garage of the Portland Hilton. Assassination attempt, cops are thinking. He coded once in the rig, got him back with epi. 5 times. Someone had wanted him dead very badly. Caldwell was moving between the monitors with that particular brand of surgical confidence that came from never having missed a diagnosis. He was competent, genuinely competent, the kind of doctor who would save this man's life if the universe was remotely fair. But Natalie felt the weight of the dog tag against her ribs, the broken chain she'd kept for 20 years folded in her pocket like a prayer that had never been answered. The tag had belonged to Sergeant Marcus Webb, a Navy corpsman who died covering her extraction from that clinic. She'd cut it from his uniform before they called it, before the dust settled and the orders came down to forget Ramadi, forget the op, forget that any of it had happened at all. Forget the boy. She was reaching for the cardiac monitor when she felt his presence behind her. Caldwell. His eyes were on her hands, specifically on her left hand as it drifted toward her scrub pocket. She'd moved without thinking, 20 years of habit, the need to feel that tag, to know it was still there, still real. His gaze followed the gesture like a camera on a tripod, and she watched his pupils dilate just slightly. Watched him calculate. He saw it. Not the tag itself, she was faster than that, the chain already disappearing into the pocket's dark mouth, but he saw the gesture. He saw the tremor that wasn't quite a tremor, the hesitation that lasted maybe 2/3 of a second, the way her breathing had changed. He'd seen someone who knew this man. Not as a patient. As something else. His eyes narrowed. His jaw set. And then he turned back to the monitors without saying a word. $2.4 million per year was what Caldwell made as Chief of Emergency Medicine at Oak Creek Memorial. Natalie had seen his bio in the hospital newsletter, Princeton undergrad, Johns Hopkins Medical School, fellowship at Mass General. His family owned commercial real estate across 3 states. His wife served on the board of the Portland Art Museum. He existed in a world of consequence, of connections, of the kind of quiet power that came from generations of people saying yes to your family name. He would protect that power like a wolf protecting a den. And somehow, in the span of 2 seconds, he'd realized that Natalie represented a threat to it. At 3:17 that afternoon, Dr. Caldwell called her into his office. The door closed behind her with the kind of soft click that felt like a vault ceiling. He didn't look up from his computer. "Effective immediately," he said, still staring at the screen, "you're being transferred to pediatrics. Tell HR on your way out. You'll start the day shift next Monday." Natalie stood very still. The office smelled like expensive cologne and the faint electric scent that clung to new leather. His desk was perfectly organized, fountain pens aligned at right angles, a photo of his wife and 2 teenage sons in a silver frame, a calendar with entries in meticulous handwriting. "Doctor, I have 12 years of trauma experience," she said quietly. "I'm the most senior nurse on the night rotation. The general will receive excellent care from the staff I assign," Caldwell said. He finally looked at her, and his smile was the kind that a shark might offer before striking. "Pediatrics is more suitable for your skill set. Less stress. Fewer complications. I'm sure you understand." She understood perfectly. She was being removed. Cordoned off. Isolated from the general before she could do anything that might connect them. Before anyone asked questions about why his old trauma nurse looked at him like she'd seen a ghost. "I understand, sir," she said. But that wasn't the worst part. She came back to the ICU at 9:45 that night, technically off duty, technically violating the restriction Caldwell had implied without directly stating. She told herself she was checking vitals. A professional courtesy. A nurse's instinct that something wasn't right with a critical patient's monitor strips. All lies. She was coming back because 20 years of following orders had just ended, and something older, something that predated her silence, was starting to wake up. She was halfway through the door when Caldwell stepped out from behind the pillar near the nurse's station. He was still in his white coat, still in the hospital, still in control. And he was not alone. The general's adult daughter stood beside him, her eyes confused, her posture protective. Behind her, 2 of the general's security detail, men with the particular thickness of body armor worn under expensive suits. "Nurse Hayes," Caldwell said, his voice carrying across the ICU like an announcement. "Perhaps you're confused about your job description." Everyone stopped moving. Even the monitors seemed to pause. "I'm just checking his medications," Natalie said. The voice was calm. The hands at her sides were steady. The part of her that had trained for 20 years to absorb punishment without breaking was exactly where it needed to be. Protocol requires, Caldwell interrupted, stepping closer, his hand gesturing in that casual way that powerful men used when they were about to demote you in front of an audience, that you stay in your assigned department. "You are no longer trauma staff, Nurse Hayes. You are pediatrics. Pediatrics does not treat Marine generals. Do you follow me?" His hand reached out and touched her shoulder, just barely, a gesture so subtle that only someone trained to read violence would recognize it as a territorial claim. Caldwell was establishing hierarchy. Establishing that she was beneath him, below the line, not worth the oxygen she was breathing. The general's daughter looked at her with something between sympathy and embarrassment. Natalie took one measured breath. She felt the tears coming, not from fear, not from humiliation, but from the sheer pressure of 20 years of silence finally finding a single point of exit. She let one tear escape, and she wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Caldwell. Without flinching. Without backing down. "I understand completely, Doctor," she said quietly. "Thank you for clarifying." But as she turned away, she whispered something that only he could hear, her voice barely above a breath, moving past him like a ghost. "You have no idea what you're protecting, but I will find out." His hand dropped from her shoulder. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the monitors resumed their rhythm, and the ICU returned to its mechanical breathing, unaware that something had shifted in its foundations. Unaware that a nurse who'd spent 2 decades learning to disappear had just made the most dangerous decision of her life. She walked back down the corridor toward pediatrics, her pace unchanged, her breathing controlled, her hands steady. But in her scrub pocket, her fingers brushed the dog tag, and she felt it like a talisman. Like permission. Like the past finally calling her name. By tomorrow morning, the break room would be a weapon against her. By evening, her name would be on the disciplinary board. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of that confrontation, Natalie Hayes stood in the supply closet off the pediatrics ward and allowed herself exactly 45 seconds of rage. Not trembling. Not breaking. Not surrendering. Just rage. Pure, controlled, and very, very focused. Caldwell had made his first real mistake. He'd shown her that he was afraid. And Major Natalie Hayes had spent 20 years learning how to find people who were afraid and extract exactly what she needed from them. The pediatrics ward smelled like sanitizer and crayon dust, a deliberate assignment meant to distance her from the ICU, from him, from everything that mattered. Natalie hung the last patient chart on its slot. Marcus Chen, 7 years old, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, day 42 of induction, and felt the weight of the reassignment settle across her shoulders like a lead apron. Caldwell hadn't said a word when he'd walked her down here that morning, just gestured toward the nursing station and left her standing in a hallway where children's drawings decorated every wall. Innocence rendered in crayon. She moved through it like a ghost, checking fours, adjusting drip rates, monitoring vitals with the mechanical precision of someone performing choreography she'd memorized years ago. But her mind was elsewhere. The general's 5 gunshot wounds hadn't been random. The angles were wrong for street violence, too coordinated, too placed, each round a statement rather than panic. 2 center mass, 1 through the upper shoulder, 2 clustered near the subclavian artery. Someone had trained the shooter. Someone had wanted him dead with professional certainty. And Caldwell knew why. The recognition had flickered across his face when he'd caught her with the dog tag, that fraction of a second before the mask slipped back down. He wasn't protecting protocol. He was protecting something classified. Something worth killing for. She finished her rounds at 1:43 p.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless industrial song. She moved toward the break room because it was her break time, because routine was armor, because giving Caldwell any ammunition by deviating from her schedule would be another mistake she couldn't afford. The break room was crowded, 8 nurses, 2 residents, a phlebotomist, all scattered across mismatched chairs with their terrible coffee and their sandwiches and their conversations that stopped like a cut audio feed the moment her hand reached the door. Natalie stepped inside. Silence crystallized. 1 nurse stood, Sarah from day shift, 26, kind eyes, had borrowed Natalie's trauma shears last week. Then another stood. And another. The movement was synchronized, choreographed, a single wave of bodies rising from chairs in unison. Nobody spoke. Nobody made eye contact except Caldwell's protégé, a resident named James who watched her face with the hunger of a man learning how to destroy someone. They filed past her like mourners leaving a funeral, and she stood motionless near the door, her hand still extended toward the empty room. The silence wasn't just absence of sound. It was a deliberate message spelled out in posture, in the collective turning away, in the sound of the break room door swinging shut and leaving her alone with a half-empty coffee pot and the hum of a refrigerator that hadn't been defrosted in months. She took 1 measured breath. Sat down. Opened her lunch container, a turkey sandwich she'd made at 5 a.m. in her apartment in northeast Portland, the same apartment where she lived alone, where no photographs hung on walls, where the only evidence of her past was a locked file box under the bed. The sandwich tasted like cardboard. She chewed mechanically, each bite a refusal to break, to retreat to a supply closet, to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fracture. By 4:17 p.m., her name appeared on the disciplinary board outside the nursing director's office. Insubordination and unauthorized patient contact. The notice was formal, typed, signed by Miranda Walsh, the director, with Caldwell's countersignature in blue ink. Insubordination. As if she'd raised her voice, defied a direct order, made a scene. She'd helped save someone's life. She'd kept him breathing. And that had become insubordination. She found the notice because she was checking the staff schedule, looking for her next shift, trying to locate any remaining normal geography in a hospital that was reshaping itself around her like a living thing. The paper was printed on institutional beige, the kind of memo that ended careers if you weren't careful. She read it twice. Didn't crumple it. Didn't even let her jaw tighten. She just read the words with the same clinical detachment she'd used to read a pathology report, then walked away before anyone could see her standing there. The restrictions came next. Access card revoked for ICU, CCU, and trauma bays, effective immediately. She was confined to pediatrics and the emergency department's waiting room where families gathered and worried and wept. Her schedule was redrawn. Now she'd work exclusively 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., keeping her away from night shift operations, away from emergencies that happened in the dark, away from any situation where her military muscle memory might become visible. Caldwell was competent at this, she realized. He wasn't just bullying her. He was dismantling her methodically, removing her access to leverage, isolating her with the precision of a man who'd been planning something like this for years. She caught him watching her on Thursday, standing near the medication dispensary as she restocked Pediatric for Solutions. His eyes tracked her movements with a predatory patience, the kind of stare that belongs to something assessing prey. He wore his white coat like armor, the stethoscope draped around his neck, a symbol of authority he'd learned to weaponize. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. He smiled. A thin expression, all teeth, no warmth. She turned back to her work and continued arranging vials with both hands steady, her breathing even, her face empty as a hospital wall. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came Friday morning when she found herself in the hallway near Caldwell's office and he stepped directly into her path, not blocking her escape but creating a moment of forced proximity. His voice dropped below the ambient noise of the hospital floor, a sound like a tank idling in a garage, all menace and restrained power. "You're a liability now, Nurse Hayes," he said, each word placed with surgical precision. "The staff knows it. The administration knows it. And if you have any sense, you'll transfer out before I have to file reports that will end your career permanently." She didn't move. Didn't step around him. Didn't demand space or invoke her rights. She just looked at him, eye contact held steady, breath controlled, the trembling not fear but something far more dangerous, restraint. She opened her mouth and heard her own voice emerge, quiet as a prayer whispered in a church no one visits anymore. "You have no idea what you're protecting, but I will find out." His face changed. Not dramatically. Just a subtle shift in the muscles around his eyes, a tightening at the corners of his mouth. Surprise. Or recognition. Or both. Then the mask descended again, and he stepped aside, and she walked past him toward the pediatrics ward where Marcus Chen was waiting for his morning chemotherapy and a nurse who hadn't slept in 30 hours and a hospital that was becoming more dangerous with every passing shift. Behind her, she heard Caldwell's shoes on the tile floor, moving away, taking his predatory interest and his surveillance and his fear back down the hallway toward his office, where he would continue doing whatever he'd been doing all along. Natalie didn't look back. She just kept walking, knowing now with absolute certainty that the game had shifted beneath the surface, that Caldwell wasn't just protecting protocol or hospital policy, and that whatever happened next was going to cost someone far more than a reassignment. 2 a.m. The ICU ward hummed with the shallow whisper of mechanical ventilation and the steady beep of cardiac monitors, the soundtrack of survival. Natalie had spent 14 hours on her feet, charting vitals, checking surgical dressings, watching the general's O2 sat climb incrementally from 88 to 94%. His color was returning. His pupils reactive. The first 48 hours post-op were the gauntlet, and he was going to make it. She was standing at the med station reviewing antibiotic protocols when the elevator doors opened at the end of the corridor. 2 men in borrowed scrubs wheeled a supply cart toward the ICU. Nothing remarkable about that. Hospital staff moved through these hallways at all hours, retrieving equipment, restocking linens. But Natalie's hands stopped moving. Her jaw tightened. Something in the way they moved, synchronized, controlled, the kind of precision that came from training, sent ice through her chest. She didn't consciously decide what happened next. 20 years of muscle memory doesn't ask for permission. The men entered the general's room. Natalie was already moving, covering ground with the controlled stride of someone who had rehearsed the approach 1,000 times in a different lifetime. The first man's hand came up from beneath the cart. Not a syringe. The shape was all wrong. Metal catching fluorescent light. ASIG sour, suppressor threaded to the barrel. Natalie threw herself between the weapon and the general's bed. The first shot hit her chest. Center mass. The impact was a hammer blow, driving breath from her lungs, spinning her half sideways. She didn't scream. Didn't falter. The second shot followed immediately, catching her shoulder, the burning white heat of a round passing through soft tissue. She was on the ground, and the training that had been sleeping for 2 decades woke up all at once. Pain was information. The third man was reaching for the general when Natalie's muscle memory took over completely. Her hand came up, connected with the wrist holding the weapon with the kind of force that made bone pop. The gun clattered across the floor. She moved like something predatory, smooth, economical, terrifying, and the third shooter never had time to process what was happening before her elbow came up and caught him in the throat. Air. Silence. Then the sound of his body hitting the wall. The first 2 men were running. One of them fired twice, wild shots, before they vanished into the hallway. Natalie didn't chase them. Instead, she looked down at the blood pouring from her chest and shoulder, and her hands moved on their own, the same hands that had held 14-year-old girls in a collapsed building while shrapnel sang overhead. The same hands that had sewn wounds shut with dental floss and kept people alive on floors with no electricity, no running water, no mercy. She reached into the supply cabinet beneath the trauma station. Pulled out an MRE packet, meals ready to eat, field rations that lasted 20 years if you needed them to. She tore open the packaging with her teeth and extracted the cardboard backing. Military-grade bandaging didn't exist in civilian hospitals, but this would do. She pressed the stiff cardboard against the entry wound on her chest, using her good arm to apply pressure while her shoulder screamed. The bleeding slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. "Call security," she said quietly to the nurse frozen in the doorway, her voice the same calm tone she used to order antibiotics. "Tell them 2 suspects, armed, heading toward the south stairwell. Then call Dr. Caldwell. Tell him there's been an incident." The nurse didn't move. Just stared at Natalie, at the blood, at the way she was holding a piece of cardboard and field dressing against a gunshot wound like she'd done it 100 times. Because she had. Natalie walked to the ER herself. Not ran. Walked. The cardboard chest seal held enough pressure to keep the bleeding from accelerating. Her left shoulder screamed with every step, but pain was just data and she was very good at reading data. She made it to the trauma bay, informed the attending of the gunshot wounds, 2 to the chest, 1 to the shoulder, and handed over the improvised dressing with the kind of clinical precision that made no sense coming from a night shift nurse. Then she sat down on the stretcher. Then the world went black. She woke in recovery to a paperwork coup. The documents were waiting on her bedside table in a manila folder, arranged with the precision of a lawyer's filing system. Suspension pending investigation. Mental health evaluation required before return to duty. Patient contact violation. Possible involvement in the assault. The handwriting on each page was precise, clinical, authoritative, and it belonged to Dr. Caldwell. Every single page. Her shoulder was wrapped in surgical dressings. Her chest ached with the dull throb of serious trauma. 2 bullets had missed her heart by the width of a fingernail and the fortune of angle. The surgeon who'd come in to check her vitals had given her a look that said he knew exactly what that cardboard dressing meant, and it terrified him. But the look on the hospital administrator's face when she walked into his office 3 hours later was worse. He was waiting for her, Caldwell beside him, both men wearing the kind of gravity that came with conspiracy. The administrator, a man named Richard Bancroft, whose golf handicap with Caldwell was legendary among hospital staff, slid a severance agreement across his desk like he was extending a mercy. "Natalie, we think it's best if you step away," he said. His voice carried the kind of false sympathy that sounded like a threat wrapped in velvet. "You've been through trauma. You made a series of questionable decisions last night. The security footage from the ICU is, unfortunately, corrupted. We have no visual confirmation of what occurred. The police are asking questions about your involvement in the assault, your background, your state of mind. A psychiatric hold was discussed." "I stopped an assassination attempt," Natalie said. The words came out flat and quiet. "I saved a patient's life. That's what happened." "What happened," Caldwell said, leaning forward, "is that a night shift nurse with no tactical training suddenly displayed combat capabilities that make no sense for someone in her position. What happened is that a suppressed weapon was used, which suggests professionals, and yet somehow you were able to disarm a trained shooter while taking 3 rounds. What happened is that you have a documented history of erratic behavior, reassignment issues, disciplinary concerns, and nobody in this hospital can fully explain who you actually are." He smiled. The smile of someone holding cards he knew would win the hand. "You're going to resign," he continued. "Quietly. Today. You're going to accept this severance package, $200,000, which is generous, and you're going to disappear. Again. You're very good at that." The light in Natalie's eyes went flat. She didn't take the pen he offered. She didn't sign the agreement. She just stood up, the movement smooth and controlled, and walked out of his office while both men sat in stunned silence at her refusal. Her phone had been confiscated by Portland police as evidence. The security footage from the ICU had been corrupted, not by accident, she now understood, but by design. Caldwell's design. The police report, which she was allowed to read while still hospitalized, described her as erratic and uncooperative, as though saving a man's life while bleeding out was somehow suspicious behavior. She signed herself out AMA, against medical advice, with her shoulder still seeping blood through fresh dressings, and drove north through Portland rain that hammered the windshield like accusations. Willamette National Cemetery lay gray and quiet beneath a sky the color of concrete. The rain didn't stop, if anything, it intensified as she walked toward the marker she hadn't visited in 3 years. The headstone read, "Marcus James Hayes, Major, United States Marine Corps, killed in action, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, 2011. Natalie sank to her knees in the mud, rain mixing with the tears she'd promised herself she wouldn't shed. Her shoulder screamed. Blood soaked through her jacket. The suspension letter, already signed and processed by Caldwell despite her refusal, crumpled in her fist like all the promises she'd ever kept were suddenly worthless. "I promised you," she whispered to the headstone, to the man beneath it, to the ghost of who she used to be before everything was classified and buried and erased. "I promised I'd stay hidden. That I'd be just a nurse, just normal. Just someone no one would ever have to worry about." She pressed her palm against the cold marble. "But I failed him, Marcus. I failed that little boy I saved in Ramadi, and now I can't save anyone. They erased me so completely that when I finally mattered again, when I finally did the only thing I was ever actually trained to do, no one believed I existed." Rain hammered down. Her uninjured hand pressed against the mud while her shoulder bled out in slow, measured drips into Portland soil. The sound started as a distant thud, then grew into something that made the air pressure change entirely. Rotor blades cutting through rain. Natalie lifted her head as the first helicopter descended through the storm clouds, a massive MH-53 King Stallion dropping altitude like a judgment. The rotor wash flattened the cemetery grass, threw her hair into her face, sent rain sideways in sheets that felt like force. 2 more helicopters followed, establishing a triangle formation that turned the peaceful cemetery into an active landing zone. Boots hit ground in perfect synchronization. A full platoon emerged in dress blues, 14 Marines moving in formation, rifles at port arms, the kind of precision that belongs only to unit with 1,000 hours of practice. The rain couldn't touch them. The mud held no power. They moved like something rehearsed and inevitable. The Marine general stepped forward, still bandaged from surgery but moving with the command presence of a man who hadn't spent 18 hours sedated. He was upright, moving under his own power. And when he saw Natalie on her knees in the mud, blood seeping through her jacket, something shifted in his face that looked like recognition spanning 20 years. He rendered a salute, fist to chest, the gesture precise and formal and devastating. "Major Hayes," he said, and the world tilted because no one had called her that in 2 decades. "Your country needs you to stop hiding." He extended a file. Above "Top Secret" stamped across the front in red letters. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage, as she opened it and saw her own handwriting from a lifetime ago. After-action reports from Ramadi. Names she'd buried. Operations that officially never happened. 15 pages of proof that she'd existed once, that she'd mattered once, that someone had been keeping score while she was learning to be invisible. The rotor wash hit her like a physical force, rain scattering sideways as 3 Black Hawks descended on the cemetery in perfect formation. The grass flattened. The headstone seemed to bow. Natalie didn't move, couldn't move, as a full platoon emerged in dress blues, their uniforms pressed into geometric precision, their movement synchronized like a single organism. Boots on wet grass. 1, 2, 3, 20. They formed a perimeter around her, and she understood in that moment that this wasn't a visit. This was an extraction. The general emerged from the lead Black Hawk, bandages visible beneath his dress uniform jacket, his left arm moving with obvious pain. He was supposed to be in an ICU bed. Instead, he was walking across rain-soaked cemetery grass with the bearing of a man who'd already survived worse than doctors said was possible. He moved toward her with the measured precision of someone counting every step against a clock inside his own body, and when he reached her, he didn't speak. He saluted. Fist to chest, held for 3 seconds, the kind of salute that meant something beyond protocol. "Major Hayes," he said quietly, his voice carrying the grain of someone who'd learned command in languages other than English. "Your country needs you to stop hiding." He handed her a file. Unmarked. Standard government manila with a red stripe across the front and a classification marker that read above "Top Secret, Ramadi Operation Scorpion." Her hands took the file on their own. The paper felt heavier than paper should weigh. Inside were her after-action reports. All of them. The ones she'd been told were erased, incinerated, struck from every record that mattered. Operations that officially never happened. 15 pages of proof that she'd existed once, that she'd mattered once, that someone had been keeping score while she was learning to be invisible. Her own handwriting stared back at her, younger handwriting, sharper angles, the penmanship of a woman who still believed the military kept promises. A Marine Corps spokesperson stepped forward, rain dripping from his campaign cover, a woman colonel with ribbons that went from her collarbone nearly to her hip. She moved to the center of the perimeter and opened a leather portfolio, the kind used for official announcements. Her voice carried across the cemetery with the clarity of someone trained to be heard over rotor blades and gunfire. By order of Headquarters Marine Corps, Major Natalie Hayes is hereby recognized for extraordinary heroism under fire in support of Operation Scorpion, Ramadi, Iraq, 2004. Each word landed like a marker stone. Silver Star for leadership under impossible conditions. First Purple Heart for fragmentation wounds sustained while evacuating civilians from collapsed structure, North Quadrant, Jolon District. Second Purple Heart for penetrating trauma to left shoulder sustained during direct fire engagement while protecting high-value asset translator asset. The colonel paused. Her eyes found Natalie's. And the Navy Cross for 14 lives saved, including the aforementioned asset, while sustaining shrapnel injuries that medical personnel said should have been fatal. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of 20 years' worth of classified weight, of missions that never appeared in military history books, of a woman being called back into the light by people who'd never let her actually leave. An FBI agent stepped forward, older man, the kind who carried authority like a tailored suit. Rain dripped from his wire-rimmed glasses. "Major, we've recovered security footage from Oak Creek Memorial. Full encrypted backup maintained by hospital IT specialist, Navy veteran name of Petty Officer Mitchell. Dr. Caldwell thought he deleted everything. He was wrong. The agent opened a tablet. Hospital surveillance footage played across the screen, Caldwell in his office, phone pressed to his ear, his voice audible through the recording. Authorization codes. Payment transfer confirmations. $300,000 cryptocurrency deposit to an offshore account connected to a private military contractor. Dr. Caldwell was paid to allow assassination attempts on a patient under his care. The words hung in the rain-thick air. Natalie felt no shock. Somehow, she'd already known. The way he'd moved. The speed of the reassignment. The precision of the humiliation. It hadn't been institutional cruelty. It had been operational. Calculated. Designed to isolate her, distance her, make her impossible to believe when she eventually tried to tell someone what she'd seen. There's more, the agent continued. Financial forensics show gambling debts to the Sinaloa cartel dating back 7 years. Caldwell was leverage. Your general here, he nodded toward the bandaged Marine standing at attention beside Natalie, has been investigating arms trafficking networks for 18 months. Caldwell was the inside man. The hospital, the reassignment, the suspension after you stopped the second attack, it was all designed to silence you as a witness and isolate the general for a third assassination attempt. Natalie didn't feel anything. Not anger. Not vindication. Just the weight of the dog tag in her pocket and the rain on her face and 20 years of pretending to be smaller than she was. You should know, the colonel said, stepping closer, that 3 days ago, Caldwell was arrested during his shift. The arresting officers walked him through Oak Creek Memorial in handcuffs. Every staff member filmed it on their phones. The video trended on Twitter for 4 hours. By this morning, his medical license was suspended pending criminal charges. His wife filed for divorce. His attorney is negotiating a plea deal because the evidence is overwhelming. Overwhelming. That was one word for it. 6 months later, Natalie walked through the main entrance of Oak Creek Memorial in her white coat. The single dog tag hung openly around her neck now, visible beside her military ID and the new badge that read, Chief of Emergency Medicine. The badge was legitimate. The hospital board had voted unanimously to promote her and implement a complete restructuring of the trauma protocols based on her recommendations. New staffing. New training. New procedures that accounted for the fact that heroes sometimes wore scrubs and that quietness could be a tactical advantage. She passed the security desk. Dr. Caldwell sat there in an ill-fitting security guard uniform, the polyester cheap against his frame, his former hospital ID replaced with a guest pass that let him work nights only. Medical license revoked. Assets seized. Reputation destroyed. The board had offered him this job as a mercy, a way to avoid a wrongful termination suit while ensuring he'd spend his career watching other people practice medicine. He stared at his desk as she approached. Couldn't meet her eyes. The trembling in his hands wasn't fear. It was restraint, the restraint of a man realizing, too late, exactly who he'd tried to bury. Evening, Doctor, she said quietly, the title a blade, each syllable shaped by decades of command authority. She didn't pause for an answer. She walked past him to the elevator, and she didn't look back. Upstairs in the ER, her team responded to a mass casualty motor vehicle accident with the precision of a military unit. Half of them were veterans who'd specifically transferred to work under her. They moved through the trauma bay like they were executing a practiced maneuver, every hand knowing where to be, every voice crisp and clear. The general visited for a follow-up appointment 3 hours later, and they shared coffee in her office. Two warriors who'd found each other across 20 years and an ocean of classified ink. Later that week, Natalie taught a trauma course to a class of new nurses. She stood in front of 30 faces, average age 26, and held up a small piece of plastic packaging, an MRE wrapper, tan-colored, the kind that came in field rations. This saved my life, she told them simply. Improvised chest seal. 2 gunshot wounds to the anterior thorax. Standard protocol would have been to stabilize and transport. Instead, I fashioned this seal from materials I had available, sealed the wound, controlled the bleeding, and walked myself to the ER. She lowered the wrapper. The point isn't the procedure. The point is this: heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. You never know who's standing beside you, or what wars they've already won. The camera lingered on the dog tag at her throat, her late husband Marcus's name engraved on one side, the GPS coordinates of Ramadi on the other, and pulled back to show the hospital at night, every window burning light, ordinary and miraculous. A building full of people learning to be brave. A Marine general recovering in a private room. A security guard staring at paperwork he'd never understand. And in the main corridor, a woman who'd finally stopped hiding, walking into the future like she owned it. Because she did. If you loved this story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were capable of? We read every comment, and your story matters. Thanks for watching.